There is a specific sound a fence post makes when it breaks at the ground line. It is not the crack of green wood or the snap of something dry and brittle. It is a low, wet fracture, a sound that travels through the soil before it reaches the air, the kind of sound that a person who has walked fence lines their whole life recognizes before they understand what they are hearing. Nora Calloway heard it from the corral gate on the east side of the barn. She was 8 years old, sitting on the top rail with her boots hooked over the second rail and her notebook open on her knee. And she heard that sound and she looked up before she knew why. The machine was already through the fence by the time she turned her head. It was a track excavator, orange and black, moving through the gap where Post 14 had stood for 52 years. The post was lodgepole pine set in Powder River County soil in the summer of 1971 by a woman named Vera Calloway, who had measured the boundary first and driven the post second, because that was the order in which the work was meant to be done. Post 14 was one of 58. They ran the eastern boundary of the Calloway land in Powder River County, Wyoming, 3 lines of barbed wire strung between them. A spring latch gate at the southeast corner that had not failed in the time since Nora's mother was born. Post 14 was on the ground now. The wire had snapped at 2 points and curled back on itself in the dirt. The excavator did not slow down. Nora was off the rail before she made a decision to move. That was how her body worked when something wrong happened near the fence. She had learned the fence the way she had learned the names of the cattle and the smell of the soil after rain and the specific shade the sky turned over the eastern ridge before a front moved in. Not from a book, from walking it, from being shown. She went into the mudroom at a run and came back out with 2 things. Her grandmother Ruth's digital camera, the one that lived on the shelf above the coat hooks, a Canon from 2009 with a crack in the battery cover that did not affect the function, and the yellow measuring tape from the box on the lower shelf, the one with the worn leather case that had belonged to Vera before it belonged to anyone else. Nora checked the camera clock as she pushed through the screen door. She had set it that morning at 6:43, the same way Ruth had taught her. The same way Ruth had done it herself every morning she used the camera. The time was right. It was always right when Nora checked it. She walked to the gap in the fence at a pace that was not running but was not walking either. The pace of someone who has somewhere to be and knows that arriving in a state of agitation is less useful than arriving in a state of readiness. The excavator had turned and was moving north-northeast, along a line that took it further into the Calloway property. She could see the track impressions in the soil, deep on the softer ground near the seasonal creek drainage, and shallower on the harder ground away from the water. She photographed Post 14 first. 3 angles. The cracked base, the post position relative to the intact posts on either side, and the full track impression nearest the post base. Then she laid the measuring tape from the base of the broken post to the nearest track mark and photographed the number, 4 feet and 3 inches. She wrote in her notebook post, 14 cracked ground line track, 4.3 feet east. She wrote the time. Ruth had told her once that a photograph without a measurement is a picture, and a picture without a date is a memory, and a memory is not evidence. Ruth had said this not as instruction, but as observation, the way she said most things, as if she were noting a fact about the weather. Nora had been 6 years old. She had not forgotten it. She moved to Post 15. Post 15 had been pulled from the ground by the wire tension when the line snapped. It lay at an angle in the soil. The base lifted the root end dark with the earth that had held it for 5 decades. She photographed it and measured the displacement from vertical, 17 degrees. She wrote the number. Diane Calloway came out of the house when she saw her daughter walking the fence with a camera and a measuring tape. She stood at the edge of the yard, and watched for a moment without speaking, the way a person watches when they are still organizing what they are seeing. Then she walked toward the gap, wiping her hands on the front of her jeans. The man from the equipment crew came first. His name was Owen Mast. He was the field supervisor for Meridian Corridor, LLC, and he wore a company polo shirt and work boots, and he had a radio on his belt, and the white pickup truck behind him had the Meridian logo on both doors. He was a large man in his mid-40s, carrying the particular confidence of someone accustomed to arriving on properties and having conversations that ended the way he needed them to end. He walked to the gap in the fence and looked at Nora without quite looking at her, the way adults look at children who are present in a situation meant for adults. He said, "Your fence was in the wrong place." Nora did not respond. She moved to post 16 and laid the measuring tape at the base. The post had not been displaced, but the wire staple on the east face had pulled through the wood under tension. She photographed the staple and the wood fiber torn around it. Mast said it again, louder. He said, "Your fence was set inside our right-of-way. You need to understand that before this goes any further." Nora wrote in her notebook post, 16 staple pull-out east face wire intact. She wrote the time. Diane reached the gap. She stood at the broken end of the wire and looked at the excavator, now stopped about 60 feet into the property, and then at Mast, and then at the ground where post 14 lay. She said, "Who authorized this?" Mast said, "Our field engineer staked the boundary last week. Your fence was inside the corridor. The operator followed the stakes." Diane said, "I want to see the documentation for where your engineer staked." Mast said, "That is proprietary company information." Diane looked at him for a long moment. She was 31 years old, and she had been farming this land alone for 2 years, since her husband died in the spring of 2021. And she had the kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from the practice of functioning under conditions that would justify not functioning. She said, "I have a survey from 1971 that shows this fence is on the boundary or within 3 inches of it for its entire length. Do you want to see it?" Mast said he would need to refer that to company counsel. Nora looked up from post 17. She said the survey was done by a licensed surveyor out of Casper on August the 14th, 1971. She had read this in Vera's records enough times that the date was the kind of fact that did not require retrieval. It was simply there when she needed it. Mast looked at her. He looked at her the way he had looked at the fence, as if calculating whether the obstacle in front of him was worth the time it would take to address. He said, "I need you to stay on your side of the boundary line." Nora said, "I am on my side. This fence is the boundary line. It has been since my great-grandmother said it." She moved to post 18 and began documenting. 2 of the equipment crew had drifted over from the machine. They stood near the front of Mast's truck, watching. One of them said something quiet to the other. There was a sound that was not quite laughter, but was the shape of laughter the sound people make when they have decided something is not worth taking seriously. Mast turned back to his radio. Whatever he said into it, the excavator did not move again that morning. Nora photographed post through to post 27 before Diane came and stood beside her, not to stop her, to watch. There was something in the watching that was familiar to both of them. The particular quality of attention that the Callaway women brought to things happening near their land. It was not agitation. It was inventory. You looked at what was happening and you recorded what you saw, and you kept your voice below the level of the thing you were responding to, because the thing you were responding to did not deserve the full weight of your voice. Vera had run this property alone for 28 years after Nora's great-grandfather died. She had run it through 2 droughts and a flood that took the lower pasture fence entirely, and a winter in 1989 that killed 9 head of cattle in a single week. She had never sold an acre. She had never borrowed against the land. She had kept every receipt. every bill of sale, every annual yield record in spiral notebooks that she stored in the kitchen drawer, and later in the flat cedar box that now lived in Diane's bedroom closet. When Vera handed the property to Ruth in 1993, she had walked her through the drawer and the box the same way she walked her through the fence lines post by post from the northwest corner to the southeast gate. She said the land and the records are the same thing. Do not let anyone tell you they are separate. Ruth had said the same thing to Diane, and Diane, not yet knowing what she was doing, had said something close to it to Nora, not as a lesson, but in the course of explaining why the camera clock needed to be set correctly every morning before it was used for anything. Nora had been 6. She had nodded and set the clock and not forgotten. The cedar box was in the closet. Diane went inside while Nora continued down the fence line and carried the box to the kitchen table. Inside was what had always been inside it. The survey from August 1971. The original deed recorded in Powder River County in the spring of that year. A folder of receipts from the construction of the fence itself. Lodgepole pine at a specific price per post. Wire by the roll, staples by the pound. And a composition notebook. Plain cover that Vera had used to record the construction of the fence, from the first post to the last, with measurements and landmarks and a hand-drawn map of the eastern boundary that showed each post position relative to natural features. Rock outcroppings, a dead juniper at post 14, the ridgeline of the eastern hills visible from the southwest corner on a clear day. There was also beneath the folder of receipts a second composition notebook. Older, the cover faded to the color of old paper. This one was dated 1973, and it contained Vera's account of a boundary dispute with a company called Anderson Reese Resources that had claimed a right-of-way across the northern edge of the property. The dispute had been resolved in the Calloway family's favor. Vera had recorded every conversation, every date, every document exchanged. The last entry read, "Survey confirmed boundary at original stakes. Anderson Reese withdrew claim October 14th. Fence intact." Diane read this standing at the kitchen table with the box open in front of her. Then she called Franklin Gear. Franklin Gear had practiced law in Buffalo, Wyoming for 30 years. He had handled Ruth's estate in 2021 and a grazing lease dispute 2 years before that. And he had the particular quality of rural Wyoming attorneys who have spent their careers understanding that the law and the land are not abstract categories, but specific things with specific histories that have to be read in combination. He answered on the second ring. Diane told him what had happened. The machine, the fence, Owen Mast's claim about the boundary, the documentation Nora was producing. Franklin said, "How many photographs does she have?" Diane said, "She is still out there." Franklin said, "Tell her to keep going. Every post, every break, every track impression. Measurements in every frame, date and time on the camera." Diane said she sets the camera clock every morning. Franklin was quiet for a moment. He said, "How old is she?" Diane said, 8. Franklin said, "And she sets the camera clock every morning." Diane said, "Yes. She has since she was 6. Franklin said, "Keep her documenting. Find the 1971 survey and do not let it leave the house. Find out from Mast what documentation they have for their boundary staking and ask him in front of a witness. Write down what he says as soon as you are back inside." Diane took the survey out of the cedar box and walked back to the fence. Nora was at post 23 when Diane arrived. Mast was standing near his truck. Diane walked to him and asked him directly what documentation he had for the boundary stakes his field engineer had set. He said it was proprietary company information. She asked him a second time whether that meant he was declining to share it. He said yes. She took the survey out of the folder and held it so he could read the cover page. The surveyor's certification was at the bottom. The date was August 14th. 1971. The coordinates for the east boundary corners were listed in the table on the right side. She held it where he could see it without taking it from her hands. He read it. He looked at the fence. He looked back at her. He did not say anything for approximately 20 seconds. She put the survey back in the folder. She said, "Have your counsel call ours." She walked back to the house. Nora fell into step beside her notebook under one arm, camera in the other hand. They went inside without discussing it. Diane called Franklin back and told him what Mast had said. Franklin said, "Good. Come to my office at 8 tomorrow morning and bring the cedar box." That evening after dinner, Nora sat at the kitchen table and transferred the post documentation into a clean sequence in the notebook. She had photographed 27 posts. 14 of them showed damage in varying degrees. 5 were cracked at the ground line like post 14. 4 had been pulled from the ground by wire tension. 3 showed track impressions in the soil within 18 inches of the post base. 2 showed staple pullout on the east face, where the wire had stretched before breaking. She labeled each entry with a post number, a damage description, and the measurement. Then she labeled each photograph in the camera's review menu with the same numbering system so that the notebook entries and the photographs could be matched without ambiguity. Diane watched her do this from the other side of the table. She was thinking about the 1973 notebook in the cedar box. She was thinking about Anderson Reese Resources and the fact that Vera had sat at this same table or one very much like it and recorded a company's attempt to take something that was not theirs, and that the recording had been enough. She thought about what it meant to be the fourth woman to stand on this land and face something Vera had already faced and already defeated. The cedar box had not been kept by accident. It had been kept because Vera had understood that the day would come when its contents would need to stand in a room and be read aloud by someone who had not been there when they were written. The next morning, Diane and Nora drove to Buffalo with the cedar box between them on the front seat of the truck. Franklin met them in his office. He had already pulled the public records for Meridian Corridor, LLC, from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission filings, which were available online to anyone who knew where to look. He spread the FERC easement map on his desk beside the 1971 survey. He put his finger on the FERC map and said their easement corridor runs here. Their eastern boundary of the corridor is 40 feet west of your fence line, at the point where the excavator crossed. Diane said, 40 feet. Franklin said their equipment went 40 feet beyond their own authorized construction zone before it crossed your fence. This is 2 violations, not 1. The first is trespass on your property. The second is construction outside the permitted corridor, which is a regulatory violation under FERC's jurisdiction, with consequences that have nothing to do with your civil claim. Nora was sitting in the chair along the wall. She had her notebook open. She said so they broke their own rules before they broke ours. Franklin looked at her. He said, "Yes, that is exactly right." He looked at the notebook. He said, "How many photographs do you have total?" She said 187. He asked her to describe the documentation sequence. She listed the posts in order, the damage type for each, the measurements. The approach tracks photographed from the Meridian side. The full fence line photographed from the southwest corner, showing all 58 posts in context against the eastern ridge line. Franklin looked at that last photograph on the camera screen for a long time. All 58 posts visible in the dry September grass. The wire between them. The eastern ridge rising behind the fence line, the way it had risen behind every fence line in this county since before anyone had thought to record it. The fence looked like what it was, a boundary set with care and held for 52 years. Not a casual line, not an approximation. He said, "This one." "Why did you take this one?" Nora said, so you could see the whole fence before the damage. The other photographs show what broke. This one shows what was there. Franklin set the camera down. He looked at Diane. He said she documented this better than most adults I have worked with. Diane said she learned it from Ruth, and Ruth learned it from Vera. Franklin printed the wide shot at full page size and set it on top of the folder without further comment. Then he put both maps back in their folders and folded his hands on the desk. He said, "Here is where we are. Meridian Corridor, LLC, has violated the conditions of their federal easement by operating outside the permitted corridor. They have trespassed on your property, damaged your fence, and their field supervisor told your 8-year-old daughter that the fence was in the wrong place, which is a false statement that is now documented on a camera with a correct timestamp. We are going to write them a letter. We are going to attach every document in that cedar box and every photograph your daughter took. We are going to send it to Meridian's legal department and simultaneously to the FERC compliance office." Diane said, "What do we ask for?" Franklin said, "We ask for fence repair or full replacement at their expense, restoration of the disturbed soil on your property, a licensed survey at their expense to confirm the boundary, a written acknowledgement that the trespass occurred, and a restraining order preventing further construction within 100 feet of your property line until the boundary is formally reestablished." Diane said, "Will they agree?" Franklin said not immediately, but they will agree eventually because the alternative is a FERC audit of their full construction operation, which they cannot afford while they are trying to finish a pipeline on a summer schedule. He paused. He said, "Can I keep that photograph? The wide one?" Nora said yes. They drove home on this county road with the cedar box between them on the seat. The September grass on both sides was dry and pale, the kind of late summer dry that meant the second cutting was done, and the land was settling into its long wait for snow. Nora had her notebook closed on her lap. She was looking out the passenger window at the fence lines of the neighboring properties, checking them the way she always did when she rode this road, looking for lean or sag or post rot. At the ground line, the small failures that started quietly and became expensive if you did not catch them early. She said Vera knew. Diane kept her eyes on the road. She said, "Knew what?" Nora said she knew someone would come for the east fence someday. That is why the 1973 notebook was in the box. She wanted us to know she had done it before. Diane did not answer immediately. She drove another quarter mile. Then she said yes. "I think that is right." Nora opened her notebook to a new page. She wrote the date at the top. She wrote the post count, the damage tally, the name of the company, the name of the field supervisor, and the number 40 feet. She wrote Franklin Gear office documents submitted. She wrote cedar box intact. She closed the notebook. The eastern fence line was visible from the county road for a short stretch before the land curved away to the north. You could see it from here, the line of lodgepole posts running straight and true from the northwest corner toward the southeast gate, the wire catching the afternoon light between them. Some of the posts were newer looking. Some were weathered to gray. All of them were standing. Nora looked at the fence as they passed it. She did not say anything else. There was nothing else that needed to be said. The work for today was done, and tomorrow the work would continue, and the fence would be there, or it would not be there. And if it was not there, it would need to be put back, because the land required that the boundary be legible to anyone who came to stand at it, and the Callaway women had understood this for as long as there had been a Callaway woman on this land to understand it. Franklin sent the letter on a Thursday, 8 days after the trespass. It was 5 pages long and had 22 exhibits. The cedar box had given them more than they expected. The 1971 survey, the original deed, Vera's construction receipts, the 1973 notebook documenting the Anderson-Reese dispute, and Nora's photographs printed at full-page size, each one captioned with the post number, damage description, and measurement. Each one time-stamped in the lower right corner in the way that a correctly set camera records time, when the person using it has understood from the beginning that the time matters. The letter asked for a response within 14 days. Meridian's legal department responded in 5. Franklin called Diane on a Tuesday morning while Nora was at school. He said they responded. 7 pages. She said good or bad. He said both. He read her the 4 arguments. First, they disputed the boundary location and requested an independent survey. Second, they characterized the fence damage as inadvertent and offered to repair it. Third, they said Owen Mast's statement about the fence being in the wrong place was not false, that he was relaying information from their field engineer's staking report. Fourth, they called it a minor construction incident. Diane said, minor. Franklin said, that is their word. The offer to repair is real and we want it. The independent survey is also real and we actually want that too, because a second confirmation of the boundary from a surveyor they paid for removes any argument they have left. What they do not want is the FERC component, and they did not address it directly, which tells you what they are afraid of. Diane said, what do we do next? Franklin said we respond. We accept the independent survey. We reject the characterization of minor, and we file the FERC compliance report this week, regardless of what they say, because that process runs on its own track, and we do not need their cooperation for it. He paused. He said the photographs are driving this, the wide shot in particular. They expected a property dispute with a farmer who was upset and disorganized. What they got was a documented record produced by an 8-year-old with a correctly set camera and a measuring tape. Their response is written for a different opponent than the one they actually have. Diane said, I will tell Nora. Franklin said, tell her the photographs worked. Meridian requested a neutral surveyor. Franklin countered with a requirement that the surveyor be licensed in Wyoming with no prior contractual relationship with Meridian or any of its subsidiaries. Meridian agreed after 3 days. The surveyor they ultimately selected was a man named Dennis Park, licensed out of Bozeman, 41 years in the field, a reputation Franklin confirmed through 2 separate calls to colleagues who had seen his work in adjacent counties. Franklin told Diane that Park's selection was the first sign Meridian was taking the matter seriously. A company that expected to win does not hire a careful man. The survey was scheduled for late October. What happened in the 3 weeks between the scheduling of the survey and its execution was the part of the story that did not appear in any legal document and was not recorded in any notebook, because it was the part that happened in the way that things happen in small Wyoming counties, through conversations at the grain elevator and the feed store and the livestock auction, through the particular social architecture of rural communities where information travels at the speed of personal contact and reputation is the only currency that does not depreciate. The story of Nora and the fence had moved through Powder River County, the way stories move in places where everyone knows the land that everyone else is standing on. Owen Mast had told it first at the truck scales east of Casey as a story about a child playing detective while the adults sorted out a boundary dispute. That version lasted about a week. Then the second version began to circulate, the one that included the cedar box and the 1971 survey and the FERC violation and the detail about the 40 feet. And that version was not funny in the way Mast's version had been funny. That version was the kind of story that made men at the feed store go quiet and look at their coffee cups and think about their own fence lines and their own cedar boxes and what they did or did not have inside them. At the livestock auction the week before the survey, a rancher named Curtis Plum, who ran cattle on 400 acres south of the Callaway land, and who had laughed at the grain elevator when he first heard Mast's version of the story, pulled Diane aside near the sail ring. He said, "I heard what Franklin Gear filed with the federal regulators. I heard about the 40 feet. He looked at the dirt. He said I should not have laughed. Diane said no. You should not have. Curtis said, if you need a second witness for anything, I am available." Diane nodded and walked back to the ring. She did not tell him it was fine because it was not particularly fine, and she had learned from Vera's notebooks and Ruth's practice and her own 2 years of running the land alone that clarity was more useful than comfort in situations where the distinction mattered. The thing that happened 10 days before Dennis Park arrived to conduct the survey was not in the legal record and was not in Nora's notebook, because Nora was at school when it happened, and Diane made a decision not to tell her until it was over. Preston Hale arrived on a Wednesday morning. He came in a black Suburban with Wyoming plates, a rental, and he was wearing a jacket that cost more than Diane's truck payment, and shoes that had no business being within 50 feet of the Callaway yard. He was 38 years old, and he had the particular quality of men who have spent their careers in rooms where they set the terms, a quality that expressed itself not as aggression, but as an assumption, the quiet certainty that the conversation would end where he needed it to end, because conversations always did. He introduced himself at the door. Diane did not invite him inside. She said, "You can say what you came to say here." He said, "I appreciate that." He reached into the inside pocket of the jacket and produced a folded check. He held it out to her. He said, $180,000. Clean title transfer. You keep the cattle. You have 6 months to relocate. This offer expires when I get back in that vehicle. Diane looked at the check. She did not take it. Hale said, "Your attorney is good. But he is a county attorney in a county courthouse, and we have people in Denver and Houston who do nothing but this. The survey is a formality. The FERC filing is a nuisance. The way this ends is the same either way. The only question is whether you get paid well before it ends, or you get nothing after." He said it without heat. That was the quality that made it worse than anger would have been. He said it the way a man states a weather forecast. Diane looked at him for a long moment. There was something clarifying about the way he was standing in her yard, in his unsuitable shoes, holding a check toward her with the patience of a man who had done this before and expected it to work, because it had always worked before. She reached out and took the check from his hand. She looked at it. Then she tore it in half along the fold and set both halves on the porch rail between them. She said, "My great-grandmother built that fence before your company existed." She opened the door and went inside. Hale stood in the yard for a moment. He looked at the two halves of the check on the rail. He looked at the eastern fence line visible from where he was standing, the lodgepole posts running straight across the dry September grass toward the ridge. Then he walked back to the Suburban and got in and sat there with the engine running for a long time before he drove away. Diane called Franklin from the kitchen. She told him what had happened. Franklin said, "Did he say anything else before you took the check?" She said no. He said, "Good. Write down exactly what he said while it is clear. Word for word if you can. Time and date." She did. She added it to the folder she had started keeping separate from the cedar box. The folder for the current dispute, where she kept copies of every letter and every notation in chronological order, the way Vera had kept the 1973 notebook. What happened 4 days after Hale's visit was the thing that made the survey feel less like a procedural step and more like a reckoning. Nora found the second notation in Vera's construction notebook. She had been going through the cedar box again at the kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon. Not looking for anything specific, just reading the way she sometimes read the older notebooks, to understand what the land had been through before she was old enough to have her own notebooks. The construction notebook from 1971 was the one she knew best. She had read the post measurements and the landmark descriptions so many times that she could have recited the sequence from memory. Post 1, 4 paces from the granite outcropping at the north corner. Post 14, 2 paces from the dead juniper. Post 31 sightline to the eastern ridge at the saddle formation. But on this reading, she found something she had read before without understanding what she was reading. At the back of the notebook after the last post entry, Vera had written a single paragraph in a different pen. Darker ink added later. The date on the paragraph was September 1973, 2 years after the fence was built. It read, Anderson Reese brought their own surveyor in August. His numbers matched mine. I expected this. I measured every post against the natural landmarks before I set it. The landmarks do not move. The rock at post 1 does not move. The saddle on the eastern ridge does not move. If anyone ever questions this fence again, tell them to measure from the rock. Tell them to look at the saddle. The fence is where it is because the land told me where to put it, not the other way around. Nora read this paragraph 3 times. Then she got up from the table and went outside with the notebook. She walked to post 1 at the northwest corner of the eastern fence line. She stood at the base of the post and looked north. The granite outcropping was there. It had always been there. It was the size of a kitchen table, gray and pale in the October light, sitting in the grass 4 paces north of the post, exactly as Vera had described it. Nora laid the measuring tape from the post base to the nearest face of the rock, 13 feet and 1 inch. She wrote this in her notebook. Then she looked south along the fence line toward the eastern ridge. She could see the saddle formation on the ridge from here, the dip between 2 higher points that Vera had described as the sighting landmark for the southeast corner. Nora looked at post 58 at the far end of the line and sighted along the top of it toward the saddle. The alignment was exact. She walked the full line, all 58 posts. She measured from the landmarks Vera had described at every post where a landmark was named. Rock at post 1. Dead juniper stump at post 14, the stump still there. After 52 years, the wood gray and hard as stone. Creek bank edge at post 27. Ridge saddle sighting from posts 50 through 58. Every measurement matched the notebook. Every landmark was where Vera said it was. Because of course it was. The landmarks did not move. Vera had said so. The landmarks did not move, and so the fence did not move, and so the boundary was not a matter of opinion or documentation alone, but a matter of physical fact, recorded in the land itself. She was at post 44 when Diane came out and found her. Diane said, "What are you doing?" Nora said, "I found something in the 1973 notebook." She showed Diane the paragraph. Diane read it standing in the grass with the October wind coming off the ridge. She read it twice. She said she measured everything against the landmarks before she set the posts. Nora said yes. And the landmarks are still here. All of them. I just checked. Diane looked at her daughter standing in the dry grass with a measuring tape and a notebook. 8 years old, the same age Ruth had been when she first walked this fence line with Vera. There was something in the image that was not exactly grief and was not exactly pride, but was both of those things combined with something else. The specific feeling of watching a thing continue that you had not been sure would continue. She said, "Come inside. We need to call Franklin." Franklin listened to Nora describe the landmark measurements over the phone. When she finished, he was quiet long enough that Diane thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "Nora, I want you to write all of that down exactly as you told me. Every post, every landmark, every measurement, the way you wrote the damage documentation. Nora said, I already started. Franklin said to Diane, this changes the survey. When Dennis Park arrives, I want him to know about the landmark system before he begins. I want him to verify the landmark positions as part of his methodology. If Park's GPS coordinates match Vera's landmark measurements, we have a 52-year chain of physical verification that no company surveyor can challenge, because the rock was there before Meridian existed, and it will be there after Meridian is gone. The work was not finished. It was never finished. That was the nature of it. Dennis Park arrived on a gray October morning with 2 assistants and a truck full of equipment that included a total station, a GPS receiver, and a laptop loaded with the county's historical land records. Going back to the territorial surveys of the 1880s, he was a quiet man in his early 60s. The kind of surveyor who had been doing this long enough that he no longer needed to explain what he was doing while he was doing it. He walked the eastern boundary of the Callaway property for 3 days. Franklin had given him Nora's landmark documentation before he began. Park had read it at the kitchen table on the first morning, the full sequence from post 1 to post 58. The measurements and the landmark descriptions and the dates. He had not said anything while he read it. When he finished, he looked up at Nora, who was sitting across the table before a school notebook in front of her. He said, "Did you measure these yourself?" She said, "Yes." He said, "All 58." She said, "All 58." He looked at the notebook for another moment. He said, "Good work." On the second day of the survey, Diane got a call from Craig Dunbar, Meridian's local counsel. Dunbar was professionally pleasant in the way of attorneys who have been instructed to be professionally pleasant while delivering information that is not pleasant. He said, "Miss Callaway, I want to make you aware that Meridian has obtained a temporary court order staying the effect of the 1971 survey pending the outcome of the independent survey. This means the 1971 document cannot be used as controlling evidence in any proceeding until the independent survey is complete." Diane said, "We know about the order. Franklin told us yesterday." Dunbar said, "I also want to make clear that Meridian's position remains that the fence location is in dispute, and that the company is not in a position to accept liability for any damage until that dispute is resolved." Diane said, "Mr. Park is on day 2 of 3. The dispute will be resolved by the end of the week." Dunbar said, "My client has asked me to convey that there is still an open offer on the property." Diane said the offer was declined. Dunbar said the new figure is $240,000. Diane said, "Tell your client to wait for the survey." She hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment. The cedar box was on the counter. She looked at it. She thought about Vera writing in the dark ink 2 years after the fence was built. Not because she had to, but because she had known that someone would need to read it someday. That was the thing about Vera that the cedar box kept proving over and over. She had not prepared for herself. She had prepared for the women who would come after her and face what she had already faced. She put the phone in her pocket and went out to see how Dennis Park was getting on with Post 27. Park finished on the 3rd day. He packed his equipment into the truck at 4 in the afternoon and said he would have his certified report to Franklin's office within 2 weeks. He shook Diane's hand at the truck. He looked at Nora, who had come out of the house when she heard the truck engine and was standing at the edge of the yard with her notebook. He said, "I checked all the landmarks." Nora said, "And?" Park said, "And they are where your great-grandmother said they were." He got in the truck and drove down the county road toward the highway. Nora watched the truck until it was out of sight. Then she opened her notebook to the page where she had been tracking the survey days and wrote Park finished day 3. Checked all landmarks. Landmarks confirmed. She looked east toward the ridge. The saddle formation was visible in the late afternoon light. The same dip between the same two high points that Vera had used to sight the southeast corner of the fence in the summer of 1971. It had not moved. It would not move. Nora closed the notebook and looked at the ridge until the last of the light was gone. Franklin called 2 weeks later on a Tuesday evening. Diane had just finished the second feeding and Nora was at the kitchen table doing schoolwork when the phone rang. Franklin said Park's report came in this afternoon. He said 3 words before he read her the full certification. They matched completely. Dennis Park's certified survey confirmed the corner coordinates from the 1971 document to within 9 inches. He confirmed that all 58 posts of Vera Calloway's original fence line fell within 3 inches of the legal boundary for the full length of the eastern edge. He confirmed that the excavator trespass had occurred 44 feet inside the Calloway boundary. He confirmed in a supplementary note attached to the main certification that he had verified the landmark positions described in the 1971 construction notebook and found them consistent with the surveyed boundary coordinates. The granite outcropping at post 1, the dead juniper stump at post 14, the ridge saddle siding from posts 50 through 58. All of it confirmed. All of it where Vera said it would be. Park had added 1 sentence to the supplementary note that was not standard survey language. It read, "The landmark methodology used in the original 1971 construction demonstrates an unusually rigorous approach to boundary verification for the period and provides independent physical corroboration of the surveyed boundary that is not dependent on the documentary record alone." Franklin read this sentence aloud to Diane. He read it twice. Then he said, "We can talk about settlement now. And I want you to know, before we begin, that the FERC compliance report generated an inquiry letter to Meridian last week. The investigation is open. That is not our leverage. That is the federal government's leverage. But Meridian knows that the 40 feet and the trespass and the false statement to your daughter and the attempt to buy you out after the dispute began are all part of the same record now, and that record is going to be visible to the federal investigators whether we put it there or not." He said one more thing before he continued almost as an afterthought. He said, "I have been reading Meridian's FERC public filings while we waited for Park's report. There are 2 confidential settlement line items in their financial disclosures from the past 18 months, Wyoming and Montana. I do not know yet what they are for, but I know what they look like." Diane said, "What do they look like?" Franklin said like this. Diane was quiet for a moment. Nora had looked up from her schoolwork. She was watching her mother's face. Diane said, "What do we ask for?" Franklin said everything in the original letter. Full fence replacement, not repair. Soil restoration. Their surveyor's costs. Our legal fees, including the 1971 survey authentication. A written acknowledgement on company letterhead. And a restraining order on construction activity within 100 feet of your line until the acknowledgement is signed and filed. Diane said, "Will they give us all of it?" Franklin said yes, because the alternative is a FERC audit that puts their entire Powder River Basin operation under a microscope, and they have a summer completion deadline that is already in jeopardy. The 40 feet is not just your problem. It is their problem in other counties, and they know it. And they know that we are the first property owner who documented it well enough to make it stick. He paused. He said, "Tell Nora the landmarks held." Diane held the phone out toward Nora. She said, "Franklin wants you to know the landmarks held." Nora looked at her notebook. She looked at the cedar box on the counter. She picked up her pencil and wrote "Survey confirmed. All posts on boundary. Landmarks verified. 52 years and 9 inches. She set the pencil down and went back to her schoolwork. Outside, the eastern fence line was barely visible in the last of the October light. The posts dark against the dry grass. the wire catching nothing at this hour. But it was there. It had always been there. The settlement negotiations took 3 weeks. Franklin had predicted they would take 4. But Meridian moved faster than expected, which Franklin told Diane was itself a piece of information. Companies that believe they have a strong position do not hurry. Companies that are watching a federal investigation open on their pipeline corridor while their summer completion deadline recedes into the distance move at a different pace entirely. Craig Dunbar called Franklin on a Monday morning in early November with a revised posture. The word minor had been removed from Meridian's language entirely. The characterization of inadvertent remained, but Franklin had expected that and had prepared a response that made the distinction between inadvertent and harmless clear enough that Dunbar stopped pressing it after 2 exchanges. The offer on the property was not mentioned again. Preston Hale did not call and did not appear, which Franklin read as the company's acknowledgement that his appearance had been a mistake. The kind of mistake that gets noted in internal memos and attributed to an excess of confidence that the situation had not warranted. What remained was the language of the written acknowledgement. Franklin had drafted 3 sentences. Meridian's counsel wanted 5 with qualifications in the second and third that Franklin read as attempts to soften the core admission. He rejected all 5 and sent back the original 3. Dunbar called and said his client needed something in the document that protected them from the language being used in the FERC investigation. Franklin said the FERC investigation was a federal matter, and no language in a civil settlement could bind a federal agency, and that Meridian's counsel knew this, and that the attempt to include protective language was therefore not a legal request, but a face-saving request, and that the Calloway family was not in the business of saving Meridian's face. Dunbar went quiet on the line. Then he said he would call back. He called back the next morning. He accepted the 3 sentences. The settlement was signed on a Friday in late November. Meridian agreed to all 6 conditions Franklin had outlined. Full replacement of the 18 damaged fence posts with treated lodgepole pine of the same diameter as Vera's original posts. New barbed wire strung on the full eastern boundary 3 lines to the same specifications as the original construction. Grading and reseeding of the 62 feet of disturbed soil on the Calloway side of the boundary. Payment of Franklin's legal fees. Payment for Dennis Park's survey. And the written acknowledgement on Meridian Corridor LLC letterhead, signed by their regional vice president, using Franklin's original 3 sentences without alteration. The 3 sentences read as follows. On September 14th, 2023 equipment operated by Meridian Corridor, LLC, crossed onto property owned by Diane Calloway in Powder River County, Wyoming, without authorization damaging 18 fence posts along the eastern boundary. The eastern boundary of the Calloway property is confirmed at the location established by the survey conducted on August 14, 1971, and verified by independent survey on October 28, 2023. Meridian Corridor, LLC acknowledges that construction activity occurred outside the permitted easement corridor and on private property, not covered by the company's federal authorization. Franklin called Diane when the signed document arrived at his office. He read the 3 sentences aloud. When he finished, Diane did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I want a copy for the cedar box." Franklin said, "I am sending 2. 1 for the cedar box and 1 to frame." Diane said, "I know where I'm going to hang it." The construction crew arrived on a Monday in the first week of December. A cold, clear morning with frost on the grass and the kind of Wyoming sky that made distances look shorter than they were. Everything compressed under a white-blue ceiling that went all the way to the ridge. There were 4 of them, Meridian contractors, and they brought a post driver, a wire reel, a soil grader, and a flatbed with the replacement lodgepole pine stacked and strapped on the back. They worked from post 1 southward, pulling the damaged posts, setting the new ones, tamping the soil, moving to the next. Nora watched from this corral gate for the first hour, not with suspicion, with attention. There was a difference, and she had learned it from watching Diane watch things that needed watching without making the watching into a confrontation. You kept your eyes on the work. You noted what was done and what was not done. You wrote it down if it mattered. She had her notebook. The crew chief was a man named Arlen 50s, quiet, who introduced himself to Diane at the truck and shook her hand and said he understood the posts needed to match the originals in species and diameter, and that he had the specifications from the settlement documents. Diane said yes. Arlen said they would be done in 2 days if the ground stayed workable. Diane said the ground would stay workable. She had been watching the forecast. On the first day, they replaced 11 posts. On the second day, they replaced the remaining 7, restrung the wire on the full boundary, graded the disturbed soil near the creek drainage, and spread the grass seed that Franklin had specified. In the settlement terms, a native Wyoming mix, appropriate for Powder River County elevation and soil type. Because Franklin had learned from Vera's notebooks that the original grass along the eastern boundary was a specific variety that had established over 50 years, and that a generic commercial mix would look wrong against it for the first several seasons. The detail was in the settlement because Nora had noticed it when she was walking the disturbed area 2 days after the trespass, and had written in her notebook, "Grass. Here is not the same as the pasture grass. It is the older kind, the kind that does not grow back fast." Franklin had included it when Diane pointed it out to him. Arlen's crew finished at 3 in the afternoon on the second day. Arlen walked the full line before he loaded the equipment, checking each post for plumb and each wire run for tension. He spent 40 minutes on it. When he came back to the truck, he said to Diane, "It is solid work. The new posts are the same diameter as the old ones. The wire is tight." He paused. He said whoever set the original fence knew what they were doing. Diane said she did. Arlen nodded and got in the truck. The flatbed pulled out behind him down the county road, and the sound of the diesel faded south toward the highway. And then there was only the wind off the ridge and the creak of the southeast gate moving slightly on its spring, and the eastern fence line standing in the December light, the way it had stood since the summer Vera drove the first post into the Powder River County soil. The FERC investigation had been running on its own timeline since Franklin filed the compliance report in October. Diane had not tracked it closely because Franklin had told her it was separate from their civil matter and would proceed whether or not the settlement resolved quickly. What she knew was that FERC had sent investigators to the Meridian construction site in early November and had requested documents covering the full routing of the Powder River Basin pipeline corridor, not just the section adjacent to the Callaway property. What she did not know until Franklin called on a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week of December was what those 2 confidential settlement line items in Meridian's financial disclosures actually represented. In the preceding 18 months, Meridian construction equipment had operated outside the permitted corridor and onto adjacent private property in Carbon County, Wyoming, and in Musselshell County, Montana. Both had been resolved with cash payments to the property owners. Neither had been reported to FERC. The failure to report was itself a violation separate from and additional to the original corridor deviations. Franklin said the Callaway documentation was the first time Meridian's corridor deviations were recorded with the kind of specificity that made a federal case possible. The other 2 property owners accepted settlements without documenting what had happened, which meant that Meridian's pattern was invisible until your daughter photographed post 14 with a measuring tape and a correctly set camera. Diane said, "What happens to Meridian?" Franklin said, "That is not our case. That is the federal government's case. What I can tell you is that the Powder River Basin Pipeline Project has been suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. and that Meridian's regional operating license is under review, and that Preston Hale is no longer listed as Vice President of Operations on the company's public filings as of 2 weeks ago. Diane said he is gone. Franklin said he is gone. There was a silence on the line. Outside the kitchen window, Diane could see the eastern fence line in the late afternoon light. The new posts were a slightly lighter color than the older surviving posts, the treated wood not yet weathered to the gray of the originals. In a few seasons, they would match. In a decade, you would not be able to tell which ones were Vera's and which ones were replacements. The boundary would just be the boundary the way it had always been. She said, "Does Nora know about the investigation?" Franklin said, "Not yet." "I thought you should decide when to tell her." Diane said, "I will tell her when she is old enough to understand what it means, not the facts. She already understands the facts. I mean, what it means that one person writing things down in a notebook can make a federal case possible. That is a larger thing to carry than a fence line." Franklin said she is already carrying it. She has been since September. Diane said, "I know, but there is a difference between carrying something and knowing the full weight of it." Franklin said, "Yes, I suppose there is." The Powder River County Commissioner's Office scheduled a public meeting in January to address complaints from 3 ranching families about Meridian's construction practices in the county. The meeting was held on a Thursday evening in the county building in Casey, a room with folding chairs and a podium, and a wall-mounted map of the county with the Meridian corridor marked in red. 43 people attended. Diane went. Nora stayed home because it was a school night, and because Diane had decided that the public meeting was adult business even if the situation that had made it necessary was not. Franklin was there. Dennis Park was there, which Diane had not expected. Curtis Plum was there, and he sat in the second row and did not say anything during the public comment period, and did not need to. His presence was itself a statement about what the community thought of how the matter had been handled. Craig Dunbar was not there. Meridian sent a different attorney, a woman from their Denver office named Catherine Soule, who was prepared and careful, and said very little that committed Meridian to anything specific, which was the correct strategy for an attorney representing a company under federal investigation, and which satisfied no one in the room but was not intended to. The commissioner, a man named Walter Briggs, who had been running Powder River County administration for 11 years, opened the meeting and let it run for 2 hours. He had read the Callaway settlement documents. He had read the FERC inquiry letter. At the end of the 2 hours, he looked at Catherine Soule and said, "Your company came into this county and operated outside its federal authorization and onto private land. And when the first property owner documented it properly and filed a federal complaint, the investigation found that this was not the first time." He said, "I want to know what Meridian intends to do differently on the portion of the corridor that has not yet been constructed." Soule said she was not authorized to make operational commitments on behalf of the company at this proceeding. Briggs said, "Then I would encourage you to convey to whoever is authorized that this county will be watching every foot of that corridor from this point forward, and that the next property owner who finds your equipment on their land will have the benefit of knowing exactly how to document it and exactly where to file." He adjourned the meeting. Outside in the parking lot afterward, Franklin found Diane near her truck. He said, "Briggs is going to be useful going forward." She said, "I know." She had watched Briggs during the meeting and recognized the quality. He had the same quality Vera had described in the 1973 notebook when writing about the county official who had verified the Anderson-Reese boundary the first time. He was a man who understood that the county's land records were not abstractions, but the actual structure of actual lives, and that protecting them was his job, in the same way that protecting the road system was his job. She drove home on the county road in the January dark. The headlights caught the eastern fence line for a few seconds as she turned into the property. the new posts bright and straight in the light before she swung toward the barn. She stopped the truck and sat for a moment with the engine running, looking at the fence through the windshield. 58 posts, 3 lines of wire, a spring latch gate at the southeast corner. Vera had built it in 1971, and a company had come for it in 2023, and it was still there, which was the only outcome that had ever been acceptable. And the reason it was still there was that 4 women across 4 generations had understood the same thing about the relationship between land and records and the specific patience required to hold both. Diane turned the engine off and went inside. Nora was at the kitchen table. She had been asleep in her chair, her head resting on her folded arms, her notebook open on the page she had been writing before she fell asleep. Diane stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at her. The cedar box was on the counter where it always was. The framed acknowledgement was on the wall above the kitchen drawer. 3 sentences on Meridian Corridor, LLC letterhead, acknowledging what the land and the records and a child with a measuring tape had proven beyond any reasonable argument. Next to it was the wide-shot photograph, the full eastern fence line from the southwest corner. The image that Franklin had said changed the tone of the entire case. Nora had taken it because she wanted to show what was there before the damage. She had not known yet what it would become. She had only known that the whole fence mattered, not just the parts that broke. Diane did not wake her. She pulled the blanket from the back of the chair and laid it over her daughter's shoulders. She looked at the notebook open to the last entry Nora had written before she fell asleep. It read, "January meeting at County Building. Commissioner Briggs told Meridian this county would be watching. Franklin says FERC investigation is still open. Pipeline suspended. Preston Hale no longer with company." Vera was right. Diane read the last line twice. Then she turned off the kitchen light and went down the hall, leaving Nora at the table in the quiet of the house asleep over her notebook. The way the women before her had fallen asleep over theirs in the seasons when the work did not stop, because the night came. On the first Saturday after the new year, Diane and Nora walked the eastern fence line together. They started at the northwest corner at post 14 paces from the granite outcropping that had been there since before any of them were born, and would be there after all of them were gone. The morning was cold and clear, the sky the particular pale blue of Wyoming winter, the grass flat and frost-covered, the ridge sharp against the light. Their breath came in small clouds. Nora had her notebook. She checked post 1. New treated pine straight in the ground, the surface still showing the light color of recent installation. She pressed her palm against the post face. Solid. She wrote post 1 new plum firm. She measured from the post base to the granite outcropping, 13 feet and 1 inch. Same as Vera's distance. She drew a small mark in the margin next to the number. They moved south. The old posts stood the way old lodgepole stands when it has been in dry ground long enough to become part of it. Nora pressed her thumbnail into each one at the ground line and felt nothing give. The original wire was darker than the new sections, weathered to the color of old iron, but it held its tension the way wire holds when it has been strung correctly and left alone. She wrote what she found. She found what she expected. At post 14, she stopped. She looked at the new post and then at the dead juniper stump 2 paces to the east, gray and hard and unchanged. She laid the measuring tape from the post base to the nearest face of the stump, 6 feet and 4 inches. The same number Vera had written in the summer of 1971. She wrote it in her notebook and then wrote in the margin next to it, confirmed. They kept walking. At post 27, where the seasonal creek crossed under the fence line, Nora checked the reseeded soil on the Callaway side. The grass seed had not yet germinated, too late in the season for germination, but the ground was graded smooth, and the seed was in the soil where it was supposed to be. In the spring, it would come up. By summer, the creek bank would be green again. She wrote Post 27 Creek Crossing reseeded ground stable. At Post 32, she stopped. The post was an original old gray wood, but there was something at the ground line on the south face that had not been there in October. A soft place, small, the size of a thumbnail. She pressed her nail into it and felt the give that meant moisture had begun its work. She said to Diane, Post 32 needs watching. Diane said, how bad? Nora said, not bad yet. Early. We should check it in spring. Diane said, add it to the list. Nora added it to the list. They kept walking. They reached the southeast gate at Post 58 in the late morning. Nora lifted the spring latch and let the gate swing open, and then pushed it closed again, and listened to the latch engage. Clean and solid metal seating against metal the way it was designed to seat. She wrote, gate latch good. She stood at the southeast corner and looked north along the full length of the fence. All 58 posts visible from here on the straight. Run the old ones and the new ones together, the wire continuous between them. The eastern ridge behind them with the saddle formation clear against the winter sky. Unchanged. Unchangeable. The same landmark Vera had used to site this corner in the summer of 1971. Diane came and stood beside her. The wind off the ridge moved through the wire and made a low sound. Not quite a note, but something close to one, the sound of tension held correctly across a long span. Diane said Vera walked this line every season from 1971 until she could not walk it anymore. Ruth walked it after her. I walked it with Ruth and then alone. She looked at Nora. Now you. Nora said, I know. Diane said, you are 8 years old. Nora said, I know that too. Diane put her hand on Nora's shoulder for a moment. Then they turned and started the walk back north along the fence, checking the posts from the east face on the return trip. Because wood that looked solid from one side sometimes showed the beginning of rot on the other, and you did not know what you did not look at. They reached Post 1 at the north end in the early afternoon. Nora checked the east face, solid. She looked at the granite outcropping 4 paces away, pale gray in the winter light. Unchanged and unchangeable, the fixed point against which everything else was measured. The same rock Vera had paced from in the summer of 1971, when she was building a fence that would still be standing 52 years later, because she had understood that a fence is only as permanent as the thinking behind it. Nora wrote the last entry in the inspection sequence. Post 1 new plumb firm granite confirmed 13 feet 1 inch. She closed the notebook. They stood together at the northwest corner in the January light. The boundary was where it had always been. The granite outcropping was where Vera said it was. The saddle on the ridge was visible from posts 50 through 58, the way it had always been visible. The dead juniper stump stood at Post 14 the way it had stood since before the fence was built. All of it confirmed, all of it holding. The post that Vera had driven into this ground in 1971 was gone now, cracked by a machine that had not known or cared what it was breaking. But the boundary it marked was not gone. The boundary could not be broken by a machine because it was not a physical thing. It lived in the cedar box and in the county records office and in Franklin Gear's filing cabinet and in the FERC compliance database and in Nora's notebook and in the memories of everyone who had read Dennis Park's certification and heard Walter Briggs speak at the January meeting. It lived in 3 sentences on company letterhead signed by a man who no longer worked for that company, acknowledging without qualification what the land had always shown to anyone willing to measure it correctly. You just had to know where to look, and you had to write it down. Nora tucked the notebook under her arm and turned toward the house. The winter light was falling flat and clean across the Wyoming grass. and the eastern ridge was sharp against the sky, and the fence ran between them post by post, from the granite at the north corner to the spring latch gate at the south. A line drawn in the earth by a woman who had measured first, and built second, and tended by the women who came after her, and confirmed by every survey and every notebook and every correctly time-stamped photograph, taken on every morning when the clock was set right, because someone had learned young that the time always mattered. The gate latch held. The posts stood. The boundary remained. Some things, if they are built well enough and tended carefully enough, do not require a dramatic ending. They simply continue. And the continuing is the whole point. The only point, the thing that all the work was always for.